Hello everyone, this is Dr. Everson bringing you some information on the Persian Empire, the book of Job, and looking at the question of theodicy, or the question of the problem of evil, as some people like to call it, which is a relevant topic for us to discuss in light of the book of Job. First, we'll start off looking at Persia as a follow-up to last week. And the first picture we have in front of us here is a big map, right? Who doesn't love maps? Just get a load of this thing. Look how big the Persian Empire is. It is just massive. Not that this map is super impressive, but it should be impressive. I find it very impressive. Look to the east. I mean, imagine you wanted to start your own empire, right? You wanted to start dominating others through violence and having them being under your control and always giving you resources. That's a tough thing to do. And the Persians did a great job of it, or they did, not to call violence great, but they did a great job dominating. Look at the east. What do you see? India. So they had their empire went all the way to the Indus River, far to the east. In the west, they make it as far as Macedonia, like just north of Greece, and east of Egypt, in a place that's now called Libya. And so it was the biggest empire that the world had ever known. Absolutely massive. And it stretched as far south as, well, all the way down to Elephantine, in southern Egypt, and all the way north to the Aral Sea and well, today what's called Armenia, all the way south to the Persian Gulf. So it's a very massive empire. And so this is where the Old Testament story ends. It ends in the Persian period. The Persians had this huge empire, and Israel was just this little speck on a map compared to them. And let me just mention a few notable facts about Persia that as responsible biblical interpreters, these are some basic things you should know just to be able to understand the different books of the Bible in a very general sense. The empire stretches from 539 to 332, so it's about 200 years long according to math. Both of these dates represent conflict with other nations. So 539, this is when the Babylonians were able to, the Persians were able to conquer the Babylonians. And so that would be the fall of the Babylonians to the Persians. And so they basically inherit the Babylonian Empire, which was quite large, but then they expanded it. In 332, the Persians were conquered by the Macedonians, who sort of, as I see it, they had better military tactics, and they were able to rout the Persian army, and there was a number of battles, but far fewer than there really needed to be. And so then the Greeks basically inherit the Persian Empire. So Alexander the Great, at a very young age, inherited an empire that went from his homeland of Macedonia all the way to India. And his empire continued on there until the time of the Romans, although the Romans never went that far east. Alexander did. I'll mention a few kings here. Cyrus the Great, we talked about last week. I read a bit from the Cyrus cylinder. In that cylinder, he talks about how he restored the religions of conquered peoples. So the people that had been conquered by the Babylonians, he allowed them to move back home and restart their way of living. And this is of great importance because this is why you eventually have a temple being rebuilt in Jerusalem, and the biblical texts are preserved and copied in Israel, because those who had been living in exile in Babylon now are able to return to their homeland, and the temple is rebuilt, and the Israelite religion continues. And that happened under Cyrus the Great. So he would be a contemporary of Zerubbabel. Darius or Darius, I've heard it pronounced both ways by people with PhDs. So, say it with confidence. That's the key. if you're not sure how something's pronounced. You know, like in Sunday school, they always look at me to say how the Old Testament name is pronounced, but the English doesn't sound anything like the Hebrew anyway, so just say it with confidence. Darius, I'm going to go with. It was under his rule, Darius the First, that is, that the temple was completed. It was rebuilt. So it took a number of years, but in 515, the temple its construction was complete. Some people say 516 instead of 515, by the way. You might see that as you look around. But he would be a contemporary to prophets such as Haggai and Zechariah. And then the last king I'll mention here is Xerxes. Xerxes was the king during the days of Esther, which we talked about last week. Okay, and then one other thing that I'll mention here would be Zoroastrian dualism. Maybe you've never heard this phrase before, and it might seem strange, but if the Persians had a religion, it would be this. Based on the teachings of Zoroaster, or the traditions that grew up around a figure named Zoroaster. Of course, people in academic circles debate all of this. Who was he? When did he live? Was there a historical Zoroaster? And of course, all of that is, not really of my concern. I do know that Zoroastrian dualism was a thing, and it was very influential. And in terms of world history, it's important. In terms of history of religion, the history of Christianity and Judaism, it's very important. Some people see Zoroastrian dualism being influential on Christianity, such as certainly it was influential in the case of Christian Gnosticism. Maybe you've heard of the Nag Hammadi library, or you heard of things such as the Gospel of Thomas. There were a number of Christians who had a form of Christianity that's sometimes called Gnosticism. And within it is this idea that, well, before I talk about Gnosticism, let's say what dualism is. In Zoroastrian dualism, there's this idea that there's a perfect balance between good and evil. And in the end, there will be a perfect balance between good and evil. Unlike the Christian view of the end of all things, where good triumphs over evil. And of course, this becomes a central idea that's sort of written into the hardware of Western civilization. Zoroastrian dualism wasn't that way. In the end, it's still going to be a balance between good and evil, and you can't get rid of one or the other. So if you're into Star Wars like I am, this is very much like the Force, right? It sounds like some Eastern philosophy. The yin and the yang, and of course this is Eastern to some extent, right? And the Persian Empire made its way all the way to India, and of course India is very close to Tibet, so this is sort of an Eastern idea that makes its way to the West. And the good God in Zoroastrian dualism, not to sound like I'm quoting James Brown there, the good God is Ahura Mazda. And I've been told this is where Mazda does get its name. The evil god is Angra Mainyu, and both of these gods have angels and demons that sort of fight on their side, and there's a spiritual world at work behind the physical world. So that is akin to Platonism as well. And this finds its way into Jewish and Christian thinking sometimes. Some people think the folks that give us the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Essenes, that they were influenced by Zoroastrian dualism, right? And within their writings, they have this idea that there will be this great and ultimate battle. You can read this in the War Scroll among the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the War Scroll, there's this future battle that's going to come between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. And so it's good versus evil pitched. However, in the Jewish Essene War Scroll, the good guys win and evil is conquered. So it's sort of not eternal. In Christian circles, Gnosticism would be the prime example of Zoroastrian dualism having its effect. There's this idea, and in a New Testament class, you should talk about this especially when they get to the formation of the New Testament canon. There were some Christians who thought that the Old Testament is basically the product of the evil God. There's an evil Old Testament God who gives us the law and created flesh. And there is a good New Testament God who gives us spirit. And we're sort of set free from the flesh by the good New Testament God. And so it's old. The old equals evil, new equals good. And so there's sort of this dualism within Gnosticism. And of course, I think it doesn't square with the Bible. This isn't what we see in the biblical text, and for that reason, it's not it's a system of thought that really doesn't work if the Bible is something you affirm. Okay, well, anyway, that's just a bit on Persia in the Bible, just a few highlights there. Let's move on to the book of Job. The book of Job, there we have an image of a woodcut. Whenever you see pictures like this, of course, these are what they call woodcuts or engravings, where they would sculpt these things into wood, and then they could press them into printed pages in the era of the Gutenberg printing press. And so that's what we have there, Job suffering. You see his three friends, or his three advisors, counselors, who are speaking with him during his suffering. Looks like they even chiseled in some boils there for poor Job. The structure of Job. The structure of Job is fairly straightforward. There's not a whole lot to it. You have narrative at the beginning and at the end of Job. Your textbook will refer to this as a prose frame, and prose is a term that's often used in juxtaposition to poetry. Prose means narrative, and it's different than poetry. So Job begins with a story, a short story that sets the stage for dozens of chapters of poetry of lamentation, and it ends with a bit of a story. And so there's sort of there's story bookends around Job, or a prose frame. And then in the middle you have no, I went too soon. In the middle, and I'm not putting all of this on the slide because it's not something I'm going to test you on. You should simply know that it begins and ends with a short story, and then there is many chapters of poetry in between. Job's three counselors speak with him, and always in a similar order. It's Eliphaz, and then Bildad, and then Zophar, and Job replies to each of them in chorus. And then that happens again, the so-called second cycle. Eliphaz, then Job, then Bildad, then Job, then Zophar, then Job. And then there's a third cycle where this happens again. And then after that, you have Elihu's response, and then God's response to Job. And that's the basic structure of Job. It's pretty straightforward. Some people like to debate how these things came together, sort of a source criticism or a redaction criticism. And again, that's not something that I'm very interested in, and that those sorts of debates, they're important. In my opinion, at the end of the day, they don't really change the final form of the text, which is what we have as believers within the church. And so I won't get into where the book really ends or any type of those discussions. But there are many who get into that. I'll share a bit about the story of Job. You basically have a two-stage trial is how the story begins. And it's set in the heavenly court. There's the sons of God gather before God in heaven, and the sons of God appear to be angels. B'nai Elohim is the phrase that's used for the sons of God. And one of the sons of God who enters into the court before God is the Satan, or Hasatan. And the term Hasatan literally means the accuser. Ha in Hebrew is the definite article. It's the word ha equals the. And Satan means to accuse. And so it's the accuser. The term, so long story short, the first time the term Satan appears in the Old Testament, it's used here in the book of Job as a sort of title. One of the sons of God is described as the accuser. Now, who would the accuser be? Of course, we should think of this in the context of Job, we should think of this as a courtroom scene. This is the prosecuting attorney that is standing before God in the court. So God is the ultimate judge, and he has a court. In his courtroom are angels, and one of those angels is a prosecuting attorney who sort of speaks in the court. And they discuss Job, and this idea is troubling to some people. The idea that Job would be discussed and permission would be granted to the accuser to trouble Job, to bring difficulty and destruction to his life, so that, to put it crassly, someone might say so that God can sort of win a bet with Satan. And I don't think that's being fair to characterize it that way, but some people do, and they're troubled by all of this. That they would discuss Job's character, and permission would be given for Job to suffer. But this is how the story begins. The question arises: who are the sons of God? I guess I already started talking about that. The B'nai Elohim, and to me, I think they're spiritual beings, right? Who are with God in the heavenly courtroom, or the Sod. The term Sod is counsel, is sometimes how it's translated. This term shows up in Jeremiah, and it turns up a few times here in the book of Job, meaning being within the heavenly council, or have you been granted access to heavenly information or secret information? That's how Jeremiah uses the term, and that's how it's used here in the book of Job. And that really is a fundamental concept, because in the story of Job, the reader is given access to secret information, but Job never is given access to secret information. Job never knows why he suffers, but the reader does. Now, on the flip side, when we go through difficult times in our own lives, we don't always know why. So, of course, we're always in the position of Job. But reading the book of Job, we're sort of given this idea that there's more going on than we know about, even though we can't see it, which can be a comfort. The suffering of Job. In the end, of course, Job is counseled by his friends for many chapters, and it's great poetry. There's many wonderful and difficult ideas that are thrown back and forth, and you sort of wrestle with Job through all the different questions. And in the end, after Elihu speaks, the Lord speaks. Yahweh speaks from the whirlwind. And of course, speaking from the whirlwind, it's almost like God is speaking from the storm. Like you get this impending sense of judgment and sort of weightiness. And when God speaks, Job is humbled. In his suffering, he is humbled, which that's kind of a tough pill to swallow too. You want Job to, as a human who goes through suffering, you sort of root for Job that, like, maybe he could have his day where he stands up on a soapbox and sort of shakes his fist at the world and gets an answer that's satisfying. But he doesn't. The Lord speaks to Job, and he says things like, "Were you there when I formed the foundations of the earth and stretched the heavens across the sky?" And things like this. And Job is humbled as a result. Okay, so that's sort of a summary of what's in the book of Job, and hopefully none of this is new to you. These are just some ideas that I would like you to take with you as you continue on in your ministry. This last point here would be Job is an example of non-traditional wisdom. And this will, with the test that we'll eventually have, this will be certainly one of the questions. What is traditional wisdom? What is non-traditional wisdom? This is a great concept to lock in, and I think there's use in it. Traditional wisdom would be good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. Non-traditional wisdom would be good things happen to bad people, and bad things happen to good people. And in the Bible, we see examples of both. The Psalms are full of, as we'll see, the Psalms are full of traditional wisdom in so-called wisdom psalms. The book of Proverbs is filled with traditional wisdom. In the book of Job and in the book of Ecclesiastes, we see non-traditional wisdom. Job is a good man, and he has bad things happen to him, and we struggle with that. And I think it's good that we struggle with that, because in my mind, that points to we believe in right and wrong, and when we see injustice, it's hard for us, and we want to make things right. And I think that's been wired into us by our Creator, and that's a good thing. But it happens. Bad things do happen to good people, and good things happen to bad people. When wicked people succeed, it bugs us too. It's like watching, It's a Wonderful Life. Merry Christmas, Bedford Falls. There's Zuzu's Petals. Oh, it's in Bill's house, and it's in Sue's house. I forget the character's name, but when the evil the Potter, right? Isn't Potter's the slumlord? When he gets ahead, it's like, oh, you just want to beat that guy up. And maybe you've seen the Saturday Night Live rewriting of that thing from back in the day with Dana Carvey. But you want to see the bad guy face justice. And so we don't like it when it's non-traditional wisdom. But both are in the Bible. Traditional and non-traditional are both in the Bible, because both are true. Bad things do happen to good people, and good things do happen to bad people. But at the same time, if you work hard and do what's right, you will be blessed. Good things come out of that. And if you sow seeds of destruction and you become a selfish person who isn't a useful person to the people around him or her, well, then that leads to disaster too. So they're both true, and that's why they're both in there. Okay, well, let me just move on to what I think is a great challenge to Christianity, which I think maybe some of the best intellectual challenges that Christianity has had over the years. And I'll just share a bit from an ancient philosopher and an early modern philosopher. Epicurus comes from the so-called Hellenistic period. So, he comes after the Persians, but before the Romans. So he's, I forget if I think is he in the 100s or the 200s, I forget. But Epicurus was a famous philosopher who had a whole school of thought grow up around him, and it was called Epicureanism. And then David Hume, who lived in the 1700s, he was a Scottish economist and philosopher. I think just those two things. Maybe he did more than that. During that time period, the 1700s, you have, what they call polymaths. You had people they were experts in many fields. Anyway, and David Hume is sort of like the first modern atheist in a way. He lived in a day and age when you couldn't be an atheist akin to Nietzsche or Sartre, but you could. He was very skeptical, and some people wonder if he wasn't in fact an atheist, but he just couldn't come right out and say it. But in his dialogues of religion, he sets up he puts up these 3 points, and one of them must go. One of them can't stay. God is all loving. God is all powerful. There is evil. If God is all loving and he is all powerful, why would he permit evil? If evil is somehow good for us, well then it seems, and God wants evil for our good, well it seems like he's not loving, right? And that's, so for, and just to put this in simple terms, the Calvinist, and some of my best friends are Calvinists. So like my pastor is here, I'm the associate, our senior pastor is a Calvinist. I've only had Calvinist pastors for years, and I love them, though I'm sort of more Wesleyan in my thought. But the Calvinist would highlight that it seems like evil, but this is being allowed to happen for your good. In the big picture, it's for your good. And so in my opinion, it seems like the God is all loving. There's a little asterisk by that, like they have to maybe qualify that one. So I think Hume has a good point. Or for the Wesleyan, right? The Wesleyans like to emphasize human freedom. And so God doesn't want to stop evil because he wants us to have the dignity of freedom. And so there it seems like the Wesleyans, and this would be my camp, they have to put a little asterisk by God is all powerful. Or I'm sure there's another camp that would put a little asterisk by evil for that third one. I'm not sure how that would work out. But he makes a good point. Or Epicurus long ago sets this stage for us. Epicurus says, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? So you have these tensions within the human experience that are difficult to resolve, and this is it's challenging. These are challenging points to work through, but they're worth your thought and effort. And I have my own way of understanding these and explaining them. I've faced some tragedy in my own life, and I've needed to take time to make sense of it all. And this is true for most people, as folks who do ministry, and as well, just looking at our class, all the different people in our class have been through all sorts of different things. And how do you make sense of the suffering in light of it? And as modern people, we do like to make sense of it. And even ancient people, like Job, wanted to make sense of the suffering he was going through. Here's something else to add to this. Jean-Paul Sartre is the sort of the father of nihilism. He would be what you call an existentialist philosopher. He had a severe stigmatism, so I tried to find a flattering picture, but he does often look like you can't quite see where he's looking. He's a very smart man, wrote in French, and he was a great writer, a great thinker, but he did believe ultimately nothing really means anything for Jean-Paul Sartre, or Sartre, if you want to kick in the French accent. I have a handout I could give you from one of his writings. I'll just share a snippet of it here. Sartre was, of course, he comes after Nietzsche. Nietzsche's in the 1800s. Hopefully you've heard of Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche is the one who says that God is dead and we have killed him. When Nietzsche said that, he was sad because he knew that the idea of God was central to the development of morality and culture, and he wasn't sure exactly what the future held for either of those things. Sartre comes after Nietzsche, and he wanted to see Europe go down a road that separated itself from Christian morality. And so I have this text that I sometimes give some of my students, where Sartre is critical of where Europe went after Nietzsche. The existentialist, I'll just read this here for you. The existentialist, on the contrary, finds it extremely embarrassing that God does not exist, for there disappears with him all possibility of finding values in an intelligible heaven. There can no longer be any good a priori, or without experience. Since there is no infinite and perfect consciousness to think it, it is nowhere written that the good, quote unquote, exists. that one must be honest or must not lie, since we are now upon the plane where there are only men. Today we'd probably write there are only people. Dostoevsky once wrote, if God did not exist, everything would be permitted. And that, for existentialism, is the starting point. So Jean-Paul Sartre develops this philosophy of nihilism, and nihil is the Latin word for nothing. And so ultimately for Jean-Paul Sartre, nothing means anything. And this is where liberal thinking, and I would even say within academia, existentialism, wins the day, that nothing really means anything. And of course, this quickly becomes confusing. Okay, so why am I putting this in here? I think this is where C.S. Lewis started his journey, right? So C.S. Lewis was somebody who didn't believe. I think he was in liberal academia, at Oxford, and he bought into this. This was in vogue, right? This is the way people were thinking. Now, I put Jean-Paul Sartre, FL, 1960s, which means he flourished. He had his biggest influence in the 60s. But of course, he was born in the teens, and maybe 1912 or 1913. So he died fairly young. But folks were speaking this way, especially Nietzsche and others were speaking this way before him. And so I think this is sort of where C.S. Lewis started. And it dawned on him one day that if there is no God, then there is no evil. And this is where abandoning God doesn't make things simpler for the problem of evil, right? The problem of evil, the Hume and Epicurus slide that we were looking at before. God is all loving, God is all powerful, there is evil. Which one of those do you want to modify? That's a tricky situation for Christians. Well, saying that God doesn't exist doesn't make things better. It actually makes them much, much worse. Because if there is no God, and this is where Sartre wanted to go, he wanted to say, yeah, there is no God, there is no meaning, there is no good, there is no bad, there is no right, there is no wrong. And so Lewis starts his first chapter of Mere Christianity with this idea of right and wrong as a key to the universe. And for me, this was... I'll be honest, this is one of the reasons I'm still a Christian, right? And Timothy Keller later, he argues along similar lines to C.S. Lewis. And so I would, if any of you struggle or are trying to work through, make sense out of all of this, how do you be an intellectually honest Christian today in light of modern atrocities and everything else? Lewis and Keller are great resources to work through in light of all of this. So if there is no God, there is no evil. If there is no God, then we live in an age of relative truth and relative meaning. And I think this is, as Western civilization does try to distance itself in many ways from God, relativism is certainly in the water. People think this way. The college students and young people I've worked with over the years, I'll pose the question, are some beliefs better than other beliefs? And half of them will always say, no beliefs are better than other beliefs. And so then I'll pose the question to them. So what you're saying is that it's better to believe that no beliefs are better. That's the better belief. The better belief is there are no better beliefs. And then they, smoke comes out of their ears and they look a little confused. Of course, if you have those conversations, you want to do it in a kind way, in a loving way, in a truth-seeking way, not in a gotcha kind of a way. But that's a real thing. If there is no God, we live in an age of relative truth and relative meaning. So this leads to meaningless and nihilism, like Sartre. And I think Sartre was intellectually honest in ending up in nihilism. And of course, that begs the question, is the statement everything is meaningless a meaningful statement, right? And that's a hard one to do. So, yeah, Christians as folks contemplating suffering. I had a seminary professor who once told me that your own theology on this question, when you're dealing with those who suffer, really shouldn't be front and center. Like being Job's friends who provide answers. I think reading the book of Job, you realize that these friends aren't helping. And when we encounter folks who suffer, it's good to simply be present, to be there, to listen to them, to pray for them. If there's words that you can speak that encourage, that's good. Trying to form an answer for them as to why everything happened the way it did, that's not particularly useful. So anyway, hope you guys are doing well, and I hope you didn't suffer too much going through this slide. I will talk to y'all later.